The chair of the Sonoma State Political Science Department, Professor David McCuan, has been listening to the speech along with us. Good evening, Professor McCuan.
Hi, good evening. Nice to join you.
I'm sure you have a lot of notes. What stood out in your mind?
All right. It seems like we just declared Cold War on China when the leader of China, Xi Jinping, is supposed to come to the United States, to the White House. It ends in September, around September 24th. That certainly is an important element here. In addition, I was surprised he didn't mention Georgia. He talked about other states, he talked about voting machines, and I'm not sure that the speech moves the needle much for people beyond the president's base. The president is not per se on the ballot in November, but in reality he is, through proxies, through Republicans that are running in the House and the Senate, and he's not doing enough for them, and that's making them antsy, and that's part of the back channel that's going on, and the backstory, if you will, around the SAVE Act. I mean, there's a lot of violins playing for the administration, but look, there's not an orchestra here. There isn't one team that's pushing, and that is hurting them relative to legislation like the SAVE Act, but also the defense budget and other elements of what are going on. So it makes next week really, really important for John Thune, for those Republican senators that have had a problem with the administration lately, like Tom Tillis, for example, John Cornyn. That can all spill over to someone like Todd Blanche. Now, look, if Blanche is not nominated, if his nomination is not successful, he can remain the acting attorney general of the United States for the rest of the Trump administration. So there's not really that much of a loss, but there is an element of losing face, and that's a part that the president doesn't want to do. But when you're relitigating what is going on and using some of the same language and same talking points, you are obviously solidifying the base, but you're not solidifying those purple people, those people in the middle, those moderates that you need to win elections, and that could be a problem for them.
It sounds like, David, his main goal is to pass this Save America Act, and all these documents, yeah, are on the White House website, and you can go read them if you want. But lawmakers have to pass the bill. Do you think this moved people in the House and the Senate?
No, not at all. And so what they have to do then, Grant, is they have to tie the SAVE Act to something really big that has a lot of support. Okay, that would be like the defense budget, the National Defense Authorization Act, the annual bill funding programs, like, for example, F-35 fighters, like shipbuilding capacity, like Golden Dome, things like this. But it doesn't look like you can get a budget bill through reconciliation. It looks like there are a lot of things that wouldn't be germane, and therefore the Senate parliamentarian, sorry to geek out here a little bit, but the Senate parliamentarian would say that that's not germane. And so you start to cobble together a few things, and you can't get the SAVE Act through. So then you have to look at what's called a continuing resolution, a CR, that funds our government. Well, that may take us into September. Now you're running out of time. Oh, and if the Chinese premier does come here at the end of September, that's when the fiscal year ends. So it could be quite a predicament in terms of the government running, where we're at, and the person you've just thrown under the bus and talked about all the things that the PRC did. It could make things very, very contentious, and that says nothing about Iran or the economic situation when voters are worried about affordability as job one.
You know, one of the president's critics, who is the former White House attorney, Ty Cobb, said that he thought perhaps this speech was intended to add to the predicate of declaring an emergency at or around the time of the election. Did you read that when you listened to the speech?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vicki, for that. Look, the speech does two things. One, it declares a Cold War on the Chinese. Secondarily, it nationalized the election. That's exactly what he did. And I don't mean nationalized in terms of like a theme or that element. He's setting forth the terms to nationalize intervention. He's talking about DOJ and FBI, but he's talking about also DHS. And so when you talk about DHS, then that enters into an uptick in activity, in renewed ICE activity that's going on, which frightens many people. So, and you're going to send reports to states, and just to step back from this for a second, it was his FBI, it was his DOJ, it was his CIA, it was his DNI, it was his intelligence community that was in charge, that published a report about foreign interference in 2020, where they downplayed and said there was no credibility to any of this. So they were in charge, and they're going to rewrite this a little bit for sure, but they are setting up the predicate to nationalize intervention in the election. And if the SAVE Act is not passed, and it could give them further impetus to intervene when states have the authority to conduct these elections and move forward with these, it sets up quite a clash, a potential clash here. That is, I think, the importance of this speech. And we're going to see, I think, a few more of these along the way as the president is building the public case for his grievances beyond that of just the base, so that he can insert himself more directly, even though he's not on the ballot in November.
So where does this leave us?
Yeah, okay. I think the speech itself, I don't know that it has long legs in terms of moving forward some of these issues. In other words, it doesn't save the SAVE Act. It's a really tough lift for John Thune to save the SAVE Act. He's got 5 recalcitrant U.S. senators, 5 votes he potentially loses around the SAVE Act, and you might lose a few more on the margins. If they think they're going to lose more than 5, they won't bring it forward. If they think they're going to get to an 8 to 10, they just won't embarrass the White House and do that. So that means if the SAVE Act doesn't pass, and the president doesn't sign a bipartisan housing bill because of the SAVE Act, he talks early and often about the SAVE Act, and he's been talking about it in concept for some time. If that doesn't happen, then he is setting forth the conditions to talk about and to insert federal intervention. That all has to go to court. So there are people that are preparing for these court battles, and you're going to challenge what's going on. He brings up the case of California, and we take 30 days to certify the vote. We encourage the vote here. That is not the case in other places. And in addition, one final kind of component is, look, if the president himself casts his ballot by mail, he does it because that's the mechanism that he has, because it's convenient and it encourages the vote. And therefore, there are mechanisms that can be installed, the ways that we can count the vote faster, like in California, that could be helpful. There are things that we can do. If he was interested in genuine reform, what I think he's interested in here, and it's clear here, is he wants to push the grievance component, which gives them something to counter the affordability arguments and the change of pace arguments that Democrats are making about the midterms.
So he's trying to change the topic?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree. Look, you had Todd Blanche for a second day on Capitol Hill. Yesterday didn't go terribly well. It was fine in terms of what happened. The proposed person for the DNI could not answer the question of who won 2020. They're just talking about something that occurred 6 years ago. And what's happening, I think, to a certain degree, Grant, is the president is more isolated and gets more isolated information. And so, therefore, if voters are looking at their 401k and they're concerned about it, or they're looking at their pocketbook and understanding what to do about which bill they're going to skip this month, those issues will, trump everything else at the ballot box. And they're going to have to speak to this. And it was back in January where they announced that they were going to go to every state and go every week and talk about affordability and their plans. And that was well before Iran came up. And voters, want to know what's going to happen relative to their pocketbooks. And that's frightening Republicans on Capitol Hill, which is slowing down the SAVE Act, but leading the conditions where the president can try to insert his authority into state-held elections, which would then go to litigation. And if they end up in the Supreme Court, we have a pretty good idea what would happen.
Well, I guess innocently or naively, one would think that the Constitution, protects against a lot of this, but I guess it's being tested at every turn.
That's right, and that's why we got to, pay attention to the second half of Major League Baseball season and what happens on Sunday in FIFA, because digesting this much politics and setting about these conditions can get a little bit challenging for one's psyche, right?
Well, we really appreciate you kind of holding our hand and walking us through this, because there's a lot to unpack here. Really appreciate your insight, David McCuan. I guess it's safe to say, buckle up.